While not quite experiencing the financial success of its predecessor, Friday the 13th Part 2 was still a hugely profitable picture, making nearly $23 million at the box office on just a $1.25 million budget. Naturally, a sequel was rushed into production once again, with it being intended to be the closing chapter of a trilogy. That's right, Part 3 was initially supposed to be the end of the Friday the 13th franchise. Ron Kurz, writer of Part 2, was asked to write the script, but he declined. The husband and wife couple of Martin Kittresser and Carol Watson were hired to write the script. They already had some familiarity with the franchise, as Kittresser was a script supervisor on the original Friday the 13th and Part 2. Their initial idea for the film would see Amy Steele returning as Ginny. One version of this revolved around Ginny being in a psychiatric hospital dealing with PTSD from the events of Part 2, when Jason shows up and starts taking out people at the hospital in a quest for revenge. It's believed that part of the reason this idea was scrapped was because it was too similar to Halloween 2. Another idea had Ginny returning to college after taking self-defense courses, only to find the dead body of Paul in her dorm room. This concept also would have seen the return of Stu Charno as Ted. However, all this was scrapped once Amy Steele refused to return. To this day, it's not entirely clear why she passed on the project. Some reports suggest that she wanted a modest pay raise and was denied, causing her to drop out. Other reports suggest that she simply didn't have much interest in returning as the Ginny character. Even Amy Steele herself seems to have a fuzzy memory on the situation, giving contradictory statements in interviews. No matter the reason, Ginny returning was completely off the table and new plans had to be made. Eventually, Romanian writer and filmmaker Petru Popescu was brought in to make significant additions to the script, although he went uncredited. Steve Miner was asked to return as director, but he was initially very reluctant to do so. After being involved in the first two films in the franchise, Miner was ready to move beyond Friday the 13th. In fact, he feared that continued involvement in the series would hurt his career. So what happened? He only agreed to return after being intrigued by the opportunity and challenges of shooting a 3D movie and the fact that he was struggling to find work. Now that brings us to the main new element of this film. The 3D. Martin J. Sadoff is the one who pitched the idea to Frank Mancuso Jr. after seeing the success of Comin' at Ya, a Spanish-American Western film that inspired a renaissance of 3D movies in the early 80s. Mancuso was looking for something to help set the third installment to the Friday the 13th franchise apart from the rest of the oversaturated market of 80s slasher films. And up to that point, no other slasher film at the time had a 3D element to it, so it was perfect. However, Steve Miner claims that he's the one who came up with the 3D idea and pitched it to the chief financier of the franchise, Phil Scuderi. Either way, the 3D gimmick was settled on. In order to make this happen, the film used brand new state-of-the-art 3D cameras and technology. This led to a production that was long, tedious, and frustrating. It also led to a production where usual elements like the story and performances of the actors were put on the back burner. Getting the absolute most out of the 3D was by far the biggest priority. As for me, I have an interesting relationship with Friday the 13th Part 3. When I first saw it as a teenager, I absolutely hated it. While I have warmed up to it with subsequent viewings, I've never come to love it like a good portion of the Friday the 13th fandom seems to. I view it as a solid enough Friday the 13th film with some fairly significant flaws. Now, allow me to explain why I feel this way. Obviously, the huge thing this movie has going for it is the fact that it pretty much introduced and established the version of Jason Voorhees that would become a horror and pop culture icon. No matter what else can be said about Friday the 13th Part 3, it's one of the most culturally significant horror films ever made because of this fact alone. This is of course because of Jason discovering and donning his iconic hockey mask. The mask itself looks great. Simple but effective, just like the rest of the look of this Jason character. All this without yet mentioning the performance of Richard Brooker in the role. With his combination of size and quickness, Brooker turned the intimidation factor of the Jason character up a notch with his performance. I also love the look of unmasked Jason in this movie. The sick, twisted, almost mocking grin he gives Chris at the end of the film is chilling. On the other end of that, Chris Higgins is one of the best final girls in the franchise. This installment takes a relatively bold swing with her character by giving her a past encounter in history with Jason. For Chris, this isn't just a fun weekend at the cabin with her friends. This is her trying to confront and overcome her trauma. While I have mixed feelings about how the previous history with Jason is handled, there's no doubt that this addition makes the Chris character more interesting. Donna Kimmel gives a solid performance overall in the role, and the final fight between her and Jason is fantastic. She's also given a somewhat dark ending on the verge of complete insanity at the end of the film. I will also say the kills in this movie are excellent. The handstand kill of Andy, the spear gun kill of Vera, and the eyeball kill of Rick are great and have a legitimate claim as the best of the film. The eyeball kill in particular captures the cheesy, fun nature of the film perfectly. Even the secondary kills like the pitchfork kill of Fox and the fire poker kill of Chili are solid. Once again, the Harry Manfredini score is on point here. In fact, it may be the best one in the series. The disco theme is fire, and really the first sign that this franchise stopped taking itself too seriously and embraced its more cheesy nature. The big element of this movie that I have mixed feelings on is the characters. As I said, I think Chris is one of the best final girls in the franchise, and while Shelley is one of the most divisive characters in the franchise among fans, I actually enjoy him as a character. He's not just the funny guy for the sake of it. He's a deeply insecure person who's lacking in confidence, so the only way he feels he can connect and get people to like him is if he pulls these pranks. I do enjoy the relationship between him and Vera as well. I understand what they were going for is telling the story of Chris dealing with her trauma, but I honestly would have been pretty happy if Shelley and Vera were the ones to make it out. However, the characters outside of that are just weird. Let's start with Chris's boyfriend, Rick. Maybe this is an unfair criticism because Paul Kratka was 26 at the time of filming, but the character looks like he's in his mid to late 30s at least. That's honestly the age I thought Kratka was for the first several viewings of the film, and even after knowing his true age, his older look gives the relationship a slightly weird and creepy feel to it. Also, why is Rick wearing a Pamela sweater during the night scenes of the film? I just noticed it for the first time during this viewing, and it's peculiar. As for the ages of other characters, the same goes for the two hippies, Chuck and Chili. It probably doesn't help that even by the early 1980s, the hippie stoner trope already felt fairly dated, but these characters seem like they are in their 30s hanging out with college kids. Even Debbie and Andy are a charming enough couple, but a pregnancy plot is established early in the film.
How much further to the lake?
We would have been there already if some people didn't have to go to the bathroom every 5 minutes.
That's what happens when you're pregnant.
We're going to jail! I'm driving.
No way! We're pregnant, remember?
Yet nothing is ever done with it. In fact, it's pretty much completely forgotten almost immediately after being introduced. And then there's the biker gang, whose conflict with the group gets introduced only to add to the body count and have a character pop up to help Chris during the final fight with Jason. Then there's Abel, the old guy sleeping in the middle of the road early in the film. He's pretty much only included to be a less entertaining Crazy Ralph replacement and to add to the 3D. So yes, all in all, the characters in this movie are on the weirder side, and I have mixed feelings about them. But watching this, it's clear just how much they sacrificed in order to prioritize the use of 3D. First, let's start with the story. There pretty much is none. A group of college friends go to a cabin on Crystal Lake for the weekend, and Jason kills them. That's pretty much it. This movie is the Friday the 13th formula in its most basic, bare-bones form. I know that doesn't bother many fans of this film. For some, it may even be a positive of this film. But personally, even for a Friday the 13th film, I need a little more effort. Yes, I understand that neither the original nor Part 2 are necessarily story-driven films, but you could at least see the effort into the lore and world building. That's not really the case here. Even the part about Chris having a past with Jason has led to theories about Jason having other motivations. Let's just leave it at that.
I turned around. And standing there was this hideous-looking man. He was so grotesque, he was almost inhuman. He had a knife, and he attacked me with it. I was so hysterical, I don't know how I was even able to think, but I kicked the knife out of his hands and I ran. But he ran after me and he caught me and he pulled me down to the ground. I was kicking and screaming and yelling, but it didn't do any good.
The other element of this movie that is on a noticeable decline is the acting. Again, I understand we weren't necessarily watching award-winning performances in the first two, but it really feels like the acting and line delivery take a hit in this one. Tracy Savage and Larry Zerner would go on to admit in later years that scenes would be done in usually one take, with things like performance and delivery of the dialogue not really a high priority for the film, and as I said before, it shows. This movie, in my opinion, is the one that starts the complete disregard for continuity that would exist throughout the rest of the franchise. Even in the 6-minute opening recap of Part 2, there is a major continuity error, with Jason taking the machete out of his shoulder, even though we clearly see it there when he jumps through the window to attack Jenny in Part 2. This leads to Jason completely changing his entire appearance, even though the events of Part 2 and Part 3 take place in the same weekend. I've heard the theory that Jason did this to avoid law enforcement, but then during Chris's flashback scene with Jason, which happened a full year before the events of Part 2, Jason looks the same as he did in Part 3. Also, moving the production from the Northeast to California, an understandable decision to save on travel and have the 3D experts closer to Paramount, affected the film. The vibe and feel of Part 3 feels completely different from the first two. In some ways this is refreshing, but mostly it's just jarring. The lot they picked to shoot on didn't have a lake or body of water nearby either, so they dug a trench, constantly pumped water into it, and shot it in a way that makes it look bigger than it actually is. The result is a, quote, lake that looks nothing like the one in the first two. It doesn't help that it looks completely mucky and disgusting, as it looks more like a swamp. Why any college kids would want to stay in a cabin and swim in this lake is beyond me. Maybe it would be easier to forgive these sacrifices by the filmmakers if the gimmick they were prioritizing for them had aged a bit better. But let's be honest, the 3D shots in this movie are awkward, clunky, and jarring.
You know I work very hard around here trying to keep up with you and all your sloppy...
This is all the exercise I need.
That was close.
Now I should note, I say this as someone who has never had the opportunity to see the film in 3D as intended, and honestly, I really hope to someday. But I also have to judge the film based on my viewing experience, and when being viewed in 2D, the 3D shots make the film feel very dated and awkward. Seriously, who holds a bat like that? The final negative thing I have to say about the film is the ending. Unlike the previous two, this ending feels completely forced, ineffective. The original ending would have seen Chris see Rick in the upstairs window instead of Jason, seemingly alive. Chris would excitedly start paddling towards the land, while Rick would start making his way downstairs to go outside. The film would switch between perspectives as this is happening. Finally, Chris gets to the door, swings it open, only for Jason to be there with his machete. He cuts Chris's head off. This was changed because executives felt that it would have been too bleak of an ending. However, I prefer it to what we got. Even with the ending we got, it's pretty dark for the character of Chris anyway. In fact, you could argue that she is given the darkest immediate ending of any final girl in the franchise. She's driven away in a police car on the verge of complete insanity after seeing all her friends killed. So I don't even fully buy the reason why they changed the ending. This one with Pamela coming out of the lake makes no sense because of the way it's presented. Chris doesn't even know the identity of Jason, only knowing him as the man who attacked her. How would she know who Pamela is? The makeup effects on the Pamela corpse is cool, but it's really all the ending has to offer. As I said before, the jump scare feels completely forced and ineffective. But, despite having several flaws, Friday the 13th Part 3 is a pretty solid slasher film and should be an enjoyable experience for most hardcore fans of the franchise. It's a bare-bones Friday the 13th movie, but the most important elements of the Friday the 13th formula, Jason, a good final girl, good kills, and an effective and fun score by Harry Manfredini, it does very well. So despite the sacrifices made for the 3D gimmick, the 3D itself being quite dated, and just the general weirdness of other parts of the film, I'm going to give Friday the 13th Part 3 a 6.75 out of 10. But that's going to do it for me today, folks. What do you think of Friday the 13th Part 3? Is this one of your favorites? Do you love it like some people? Or do you hate it like I used to? Comment below and let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you next time. Okay? Take care.